9 days before this hit landed, the commissioner of the WNBA sent a private memo to every team in the league. It never mentioned Sophie Cunningham. It never mentioned Dejonai Carrington. It was about something else entirely. A warning that the league's handling of a completely different controversy was about to get harder, not easier. Nobody outside a handful of front offices knew that memo existed. And then, 9 days later, a routine fast break turned into the exact kind of moment that memo was trying to get ahead of. That's the part almost nobody talking about this story seems to know. Everyone saw the foul. Everyone saw the two-word post that followed it. What almost nobody clocked was the timing. That this collision happened inside a league already bracing for exactly this kind of firestorm, from an entirely different direction. And once you know that, the question stops being, was this foul dirty, or was that post fair? Those are the arguments that already played out across every comment section and morning show segment in America within about 6 hours. The real question is a quieter one, and it's the one that actually matters a month from now. Why does a league that can move in days when it wants to go quiet for nearly a week when the person under review is wearing its own jersey? Stick with this one to the end, because the answer says a lot more about how the WNBA actually operates than either player involved ever intended it to. To understand why this particular foul detonated the way it did, you have to understand the season it landed in. This isn't just another year for the WNBA. Attendance is up league-wide. National broadcast windows that used to be an afterthought are now appointment viewing. A huge share of that growth traces back to one rookie class, and Caitlin Clark specifically, but the ripple effect has pulled attention onto every player who shares a locker room with her, and that includes Sophie Cunningham, who has spent this season becoming something the Fever didn't really have before. A designated physical presence, the player whose job, unofficially, is to make sure nobody treats Clark's rookie season like an open invitation. Every hard screen Cunningham sets, every extra shove after a whistle, every technical foul she picks up gets amplified in a way it simply wouldn't have 3 years ago, because 3 years ago nobody outside the sport was watching closely enough to notice. That matters here because it means this foul was never going to be evaluated in a vacuum. Whatever actually happened on that fast break was always going to be filtered through a season's worth of pre-existing storylines about who Cunningham is, what role she plays, and how much attention follows her specifically. Keep that in mind because it comes back later in a way that changes how you should read almost everything that follows. It's also worth understanding what kind of team the Fever have become this season, because that context shapes how a single hard foul on a single player turns into a story that dominates a news cycle instead of quietly disappearing into a Sunday box score. Indiana isn't just a good team having a moment. It's a franchise that's been rebuilt, roster and identity both, around the idea of surviving a level of physical and media pressure no WNBA team has had to absorb before. Opposing defenses have spent the entire season testing exactly how far they can push against Clark specifically, and the league's officiating has been under a microscope from week one over how consistently those plays get called. Cunningham's role inside that dynamic isn't incidental. She's become, by design or by circumstance, the player whose job is to answer physicality with physicality, so that the response doesn't fall on Clark herself. That's a role with real basketball value, and it's also a role that guarantees Cunningham is going to be at the center of exactly this kind of incident more often than almost anyone else in the league this season. None of that excuses or explains what Carrington did. It does explain why, when this specific collision happened, it landed on a team and a player already primed to be a lightning rod, in a league already bracing for exactly this kind of moment to happen to somebody. It's worth giving equal attention to the team on the other side of that collision, because Carrington and the Sky weren't simply a backdrop for Indiana's story this season. Chicago has spent the year in its own kind of transition, rebuilding around a young core while absorbing more national attention than a rebuilding team usually gets, precisely because so much of that attention follows whichever opponent Indiana happens to be playing that night. That's a strange position for any roster to be in, drawing sellout road crowds and national broadcast slots not primarily because of anything the Sky themselves have built, but because of who's standing across from them. It creates a particular kind of pressure on Chicago's players, Carrington included, to be more than just participants in someone else's marquee season. Every hard foul, every physical possession against Indiana becomes, whether the Sky intend it that way or not, a referendum on whether Chicago can be seen as a genuine competitor rather than a supporting cast member in the Caitlin Clark storyline. That doesn't excuse a foul that draws a flagrant 2. It does help explain why a player on that roster might feel an added layer of frustration in a moment like this one. Not just about a foul call, but about a season spent being defined primarily by proximity to somebody else's spotlight. Saturday, August 8th. Chicago's United Center, a building that fills up fast whenever Indiana comes to town, because wherever the Fever travel this season, the building fills up. First quarter, the pace already frantic in the way these games have been all year. The kind of tempo where a possession that would be forgettable in April becomes a talking point in August, simply because of who's on the floor and how many people are watching. Sophie Cunningham pushes the ball up the floor in transition. It's a simple read, a live ball turnover, a numbers advantage, the kind of possession that decides itself in under 4 seconds. She gets a full step on the defense. She rises for what should be an unremarkable fast break finish, the kind that happens a dozen times a night around the league without anyone thinking twice about it. This one doesn't stay unremarkable. Dejonai Carrington closes from behind and makes contact across Cunningham's head and neck, hard enough that Cunningham's whole body twists sideways in the air, well off the axis a clean contest would produce. The shot somehow still falls. Her landing does not go nearly as well. She hits the floor hard, and for a second the building does the thing crowds do right before they decide how loud they're about to get. It goes almost silent, the kind of silence that's really just several thousand people processing what they just watched before they let themselves react to it. The officials stop the game immediately and head to the monitor. Not a glance and move on review. A full one, frame by frame, angle by angle, the kind of review that tells you the crew already suspects this might exceed what a standard whistle can cover. When they come back, the call has been upgraded. Flagrant foul, penalty 2. Under the league's own criteria for that level of foul, officials are looking for a specific combination. A wind-up, direct impact, and follow-through, concentrated high on the body, at the head or neck. According to the crew's explanation, this hit checked those boxes without much apparent internal debate. It's worth pausing on that detail, because in a league where officiating decisions get second-guessed constantly, a review crew reaching a fast, seemingly unanimous conclusion on a play this consequential is itself informative. Penalty 2 carries one automatic consequence. Carrington is done for the night, ejected on the spot. What most of the recaps skipped over is what happened in the 10 seconds after that ruling, because that's actually where this story starts. Cunningham doesn't stay down. She's up almost instantly, and the anger on her face is visible before she's even fully across the floor. She closes the distance to Carrington. There's a shove. It takes both benches and the entire officiating crew to keep it from becoming something bigger than a foul review. In the raw footage, you can see teammates on both sides physically inserting themselves between the two players. Not a choreographed peacekeeping effort, but the kind of instinctive scramble that happens when everyone on the floor understands, in real time, that this could get considerably worse in the next 5 seconds if nobody intervenes. Here's a piece of context that changes how that ejection reads, and it's the piece that turned this from a hard foul happened into a pattern got confirmed. This was not Carrington's first time in flagrant territory this season. Earlier in the year, she picked up a flagrant foul in the season opener for a hit to the head of Minnesota's Jessica Shepard. Later in the year, a second one followed, this time against Seattle, again with contact around the head, this time Skylar Diggins. 2 flagrants, 2 different opponents, 2 different games, both already circulating among fans and analysts well before this third one ever happened. It's the kind of pattern that, in isolation, each incident might get explained away. A mistimed closeout here, a hand that rides too high there, the ordinary physical toll of a hard-nosed defensive style. Stack 3 of them across one season though, all clustered around the head and neck, all against different opponents, and you're no longer looking at bad luck. You're looking at something review crews are trained to weigh differently the third time around than the first. Think about the position that puts the officiating crew in. They're not grading one play in isolation. They're grading it inside a season where this exact player has already been flagged twice for the same category of high-contact, high-risk hit. A third one, on a nationally televised game, against a player already known league-wide as someone who will not simply let a hard foul slide. That's not a coin flip for the review team. That's about as close to an obvious call as this league produces. Whatever you think about the post that came afterward, the foul review itself, taken purely on its own terms and in the context of Carrington's season, is difficult to argue with in good faith. Indiana wins the game, 90-86. In almost any other week, that's the story, A road win in a hostile building for a team that's drawn record crowds all season. Another data point in a Fever campaign that's already reshaping what a WNBA season can look like commercially. Instead, by the time the final buzzer sounds, the score has already stopped being what anyone in the building or on their phone is talking about. Because Cunningham isn't finished, and neither is Carrington. If the league was hoping Cunningham would downplay it in the locker room, she didn't cooperate. Asked directly whether she thought the foul was intentional, she didn't hedge. Clearly, I think it was unnecessary, she told reporters. I've never really spoken to her and have no beef with her, but I guess she has some pent-up stuff. So get your licks off. That's fine. I can take it. She went further when asked why she got up and went straight at Carrington. I popped up. I'm not going to let anyone just do that to me. I think everyone knows that. I think that's why she did it, because she wants attention. That last line is worth sitting with, because it's consistent with the identity Cunningham has built all season, and it tells you exactly how she wants this framed before anyone else gets the chance to frame it for her. She isn't a player discovering physical confrontation for the first time. She spent this year establishing herself as the Fever's enforcer, the one who steps in when a teammate takes a hard hit, the one who doesn't back down when it's her turn to absorb one. It's the same instinct that's put her in the middle of most of the scrums that have broken out around Caitlin Clark this season. It's also the same instinct that's earned her a small collection of technical fouls, and a fan base that's loud and specific about why they like her. She's the one player in the league they see as refusing to let anyone get pushed around. Whatever you think of that persona, it's not manufactured for this moment. It's been building in plain sight for months, and it's part of why her response here landed as authentic rather than defensive. What Fever fans hadn't seen before was Cunningham handle a controversy this large with this much composure, in real time, standing at a podium instead of hiding behind a team statement. No deflecting. No, I'll let the league handle that. She answered the basketball question and the far harder question that followed it back to back, without missing a beat. And that directness is exactly why so many reporters in that room reportedly walked out saying some version of the same thing to each other. She'd more or less written the calmest, most quotable response possible to a situation that could have gotten a lot messier handled any other way. There's a version of this story where Cunningham says less, lets her team's press office issue a bland statement about letting the league review the play, and the whole thing dies down within a day. She chose the opposite approach, and whether that was strategic or simply honest in the moment, it's the reason this story had legs at all in its first 24 hours. Because within minutes of walking off that court, Carrington had posted something that would change what this story was actually about. Before we get to that post, it's worth pausing here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a story like this either gets built on what's confirmed or drifts into what people assume. So it's worth being precise about what's fact and what's interpretation as we go. What happened on the court is documented on film and confirmed by the league's own review. What Cunningham said in the locker room is a matter of record. Reporters were there, it's on tape. What comes next requires a little more care, because it moves out of what happened and into what people think it meant, and that's exactly the terrain where this entire controversy either gets understood correctly or gets flattened into a simpler story than it actually is. Minutes after her ejection, Carrington posted 2 words on the social platform Threads, tagging the Indiana Fever's account directly. No sentence around it. No explanation. Just 2 words, white privilege. Sent out into a sports internet that was already replaying her foul on a loop, frame by frame, from 6 different broadcast angles. The reaction split almost exactly along the lines you'd expect, and it split fast. One side pointed to Carrington's background. She studied African and African American studies at Stanford, and argued she was reaching for something larger than one basketball play. A broader claim about how physical fouls get judged, discussed, and forgiven differently depending on who's throwing them and who's absorbing them, and about which players get cast as aggressors versus which get cast as victims in the court of public opinion. It's not a fringe argument. Versions of it have circulated in other sports for years, usually in the aftermath of exactly this kind of incident. A physical play, a swift and severe reaction, and a subsequent debate about whether the intensity of that reaction tracks the play itself or something else entirely. The other side called the post reckless on its face, arguing that turning a foul review the officials had already upgraded on its own merits into a racial flashpoint, minutes after making head-and-neck contact with an opponent, was its own kind of dangerous, especially given how much scrutiny every Fever game already draws this season, and especially given that the post offered zero context for anyone encountering it cold. That's really the crux of the disagreement, and it's worth stating plainly rather than pretending both readings are equally supported. Carrington may have a genuine, well-considered point buried inside those two words. But two words with no explanation, tagged directly at the opposing team, sent minutes after an ejection, will always be read by the overwhelming majority of people encountering it as a direct accusation about that specific call, not as an invitation to a broader academic conversation about officiating patterns across the league. Intent and reception are not the same thing, and the gap between them is exactly what turned a foul review into a national story. It's worth stepping back to note that this exact shape of controversy, a physical incident, a fast ejection, and a subsequent debate over whether the discipline reflects bias rather than the play itself, is not unique to this moment or this league. Versions of this argument have surfaced periodically across professional sports for years, usually with the same basic structure. A player or commentator raises the question of whether enforcement is applied evenly. The league in question either addresses it directly or lets it sit, and the outcome largely depends on how quickly and clearly leadership chooses to respond. What's specific to this case isn't the underlying question Carrington may have been gesturing toward. It's the total absence of context in how she raised it, combined with the timing of a league that was already navigating a separate, high-profile controversy involving race, gender, and athlete speech in the same locker room, on the same night. That combination is what made this land so much harder than a similar post might have in a quieter week. And then the coaches weighed in, and they didn't line up neatly with each other, or in one case, entirely with themselves. Fever head coach Stephanie White didn't try to inflate what had happened into something bigger than it was, but she didn't minimize it either. "It was a hard foul," she said. "I don't think that Dejonai intentionally came out to get her across the neck like she did, but it did happen, and I thought it was the right call." That's not the easiest sentence to say out loud in front of a room full of cameras, agreeing the ejection was correct while still not believing her own player's opponent meant to hurt her. It's exactly the kind of measured answer that tends to satisfy almost nobody looking for a clean villain, and it's worth giving White credit for resisting the easier, more inflammatory framing she could have reached for instead. On the other bench, Sky head coach Tyler Marsh offered a very different read in the moment. "In the moment, I thought that she made a play on the ball. I didn't think it warranted a flagrant. I didn't see the replay." 2 days later, once the footage had been broken down from every angle available, Marsh hadn't moved much from that position. He continued defending Carrington's intent and pushed back on what he described as inconsistent officiating around similar plays elsewhere in the league this season. That's a defensible position for a coach to take about his own players' intent. It becomes harder to square once you factor in the pattern. 3 flagrants in a season, all clustered around the head, because she was making a play on the ball, gets less convincing the third time it's the explanation offered. Marsh also said something else, more carefully, and it's worth including because it complicates the story rather than simplifying it. There's a lot of vitriol at Dejonai's expense. There's a lot that she has to deal with as well. When we talk about protecting players, it should be every player. He stopped short of saying directly whether the post itself troubled him, framing it instead as a reminder of how quickly a narrative can take hold once social media gets hold of it. Whatever you think of Carrington's post, Marsh's underlying point, that she's now absorbing a level of public anger disproportionate to a $1,000 fine and a 1-game absence, isn't unreasonable on its own terms. 2 coaches, 2 genuinely different reads of the identical hit, and a 2-word post that had already moved the conversation somewhere neither of them was fully steering. If you want to know why this story had staying power instead of fading by Sunday afternoon the way most flagrant foul controversies do, this is the part that explains it. Because the league didn't just have a foul and a post to manage. It had this landing inside an environment that was already primed to catch fire. Here's the piece almost none of the recap coverage connected. Cunningham had already spent close to 3 weeks at the center of a completely separate controversy, after publicly stating her opposition to transgender athletes competing in women's sports, in comments that ran in an ESPN feature the month before. Those comments didn't stay contained to one article. They generated organized booing on the road in multiple cities, coordinated rallies staged outside arenas before Fever games, and pointed public criticism from other players, coaches, and commentators across the sport. Some of it directed at Cunningham's position specifically. Some of it at the broader question of how much space athletes should have to voice views like hers while representing a league that spent years building its brand around inclusion. It's worth understanding how that ESPN feature actually landed when it published, because the reaction to it tells you a lot about the environment this foul dropped into weeks later. Cunningham didn't frame her comments as a political statement when she made them. By most accounts, she was answering a direct question honestly rather than volunteering the topic unprompted. That distinction mattered to some observers and meant nothing to others. Once the comments were published, they existed independently of the context in which she gave them, the same way Carrington's two-word post would later exist independently of whatever fuller explanation she had in mind when she typed it. Both players, in different ways, learned the same lesson about this current media environment. A short, publishable quote or post will travel on its own, stripped of nuance, faster than any follow-up explanation can catch up to it. There's a mechanical reason that keeps happening, and it's worth understanding rather than just observing. Neither Cunningham's original ESPN comments nor Carrington's Threads post were designed by their authors to become the centerpiece of a national controversy. But both were built, structurally, for exactly that outcome once they left their original context. A short, quotable, emotionally charged statement is the most shareable unit of content the current media ecosystem knows how to circulate. Clips get cut to the 10 seconds that carry the most charge, screenshots get cropped to the 2 words that generate the most reaction, and by the time either player might want to add context, the version already circulating has been seen, reacted to, and half forgotten by tens of thousands of people who will never see the follow-up. That's not a WNBA-specific problem. It's the environment every public figure operates in now. But it explains something important about this story specifically. Neither Cunningham's stance nor Carrington's post needed to be maximally inflammatory to become maximally inflammatory once released into that ecosystem. The gap between what someone says and what ends up defining them publicly has never been wider, and both of these players experienced that gap within the same month, from opposite sides of very different controversies. That controversy had already produced real consequences before this foul ever happened. It factored directly into a separate incident weeks earlier, when a team co-owner was suspended by the league for confronting 2 teenage fans who were holding up a sign in support of Cunningham's position. The league didn't hesitate on that one. Fine and a 5-game suspension, handled within days, no extended review period, no ambiguity about where the league stood. That's a genuinely useful data point to hold on to, because it tells you the league is fully capable of fast, decisive action when it decides a situation warrants it. Sit with that for a second because it's the detail that changes the shape of everything that follows. The league's own commissioner, Kathy Engelbert, had sent a memo to every team just days before this game, acknowledging that internal discussions about transgender participation in the league were ongoing and unresolved. So when a race-charged flashpoint landed on top of that, it wasn't dropping into a quiet news cycle. It was dropping onto a live wire the league was already trying not to touch, involving a player who had already become the flashpoint for one contentious national conversation and was now, within the same month, at the center of a second one. That's not speculation, that's simply the timeline. What you make of it, and whether it explains the silence that followed, is where interpretation starts, and it's worth being honest that reasonable people can land in different places on that question. So what did the league actually do? Carrington was fined $1,000, tied to the ejection and the post together. That much is confirmed. What happened after that, or more accurately, what didn't, is where the story gets uncomfortable for the league office. As of 2 days after the incident, no additional discipline had been announced beyond that fine. No suspension. No public statement addressing the post directly, either defending Carrington's right to make it or distancing the league from it. Nothing. The clearest signal of just how far that silence stretched came Monday night, when Carrington suited up and played normally against the Seattle Storm, checking into the game a little past the 5-minute mark of the first quarter, as if the previous 48 hours simply hadn't happened. As if a national conversation about race and officiating in her own league wasn't still actively unfolding across every major sports outlet in the country. Now put that fine next to the owner suspension from a few weeks earlier. When the league wanted to move fast, when a co-owner got into it with 2 teenagers holding a sign in a parking lot, it fined and suspended him within days. No ambiguity, no drawn-out review. When the incident instead involved one of the league's own players, a nationally reviewed flagrant foul, and a post that pundits were still arguing about on national television 2 days later, the same league produced a fine that most fans didn't even know had happened until reporters went digging for it, and otherwise said almost nothing. That's not 2 isolated data points. That's a pattern of when this league finds its voice, and when it doesn't. And it's worth asking, honestly, what separates those two cases in the league's own internal calculus? One plausible explanation is scale. Disciplining an owner over a single, clearly documented confrontation is a contained decision with a clear target. Disciplining a player over a social media post that touches race, layered on top of an already unresolved controversy involving a different player on the opposing side of that exact game, is a decision with far more downstream complexity. Any statement risks being read as taking a side in a debate the league would clearly rather not referee in public. That's a real explanation. It's also not an excuse, because silence has consequences of its own, and we'll get to exactly what those are before this is over. There's also a simpler, less charitable explanation worth putting on the table alongside the structural one, because a fair breakdown of this story has to consider both. It's possible the league's silence wasn't really a calculated strategic choice at all, that it was closer to institutional paralysis, a front office that genuinely didn't have a clear internal process for responding to a controversy this specific, this fast, layered on top of a separate controversy it was already managing. Leagues, like any organization, don't always act out of strategy. Sometimes they act out of the absence of one. If that's closer to what actually happened here, it's arguably more concerning than a deliberate weighted-out approach, because it suggests the WNBA's internal communications apparatus simply isn't built yet for the scale of scrutiny its season has grown into. Either explanation, calculated caution or genuine unpreparedness, points to the same underlying problem. A league whose off-court growth has outpaced its ability to manage the conversations that growth inevitably produces. Before we go further into where the pressure on the league has been building, because it has, it's worth a quick pause. If you're finding this breakdown useful, drop a comment with your own read on the fine versus the silence. I want to know if you think that gap is really about the specific facts of each case, or about something more structural in how this league decides what's worth confronting head-on. Now, back to it. Carrington herself tried to walk part of this back 2 days later, pushing back on how her post had been interpreted. "I've never once claimed that the assessment of the foul was white privilege," she wrote, adding that she considered herself far from ignorant or careless when it comes to speaking on the subject, a clear reference back to her academic background. Whether that clarification landed the way she wanted it to is its own separate question, but by the time she posted it, the story had already spent 2 full days dominating sports media coverage, largely because the league itself hadn't said a word to shape it one way or another in that window. That timing matters more than the content of the clarification itself. A walkback issued within the first hour, before the story had fully metastasized across national outlets, might have genuinely shifted the conversation. A walkback issued 2 days later, after Fox News columnists had already weighed in, after ESPN commentators had already debated it on air, after the league's silence had already become its own separate story. That clarification was always going to be competing against a version of events that had already hardened in most people's minds. It's a useful lesson in how these controversies actually move. The first 24 hours largely determine the shape of the story, and everything that comes after is trying to catch up to a narrative that's already set. There's a real gap between what Carrington says she meant and what most people actually took from 2 words with zero context attached. Her argument is that she was gesturing at a broader concept, not accusing the officiating crew of bias in that specific call. Her critics aren't buying the distinction, arguing that whatever nuance she intended got erased the moment she tagged the Fever's own account in the same breath as her ejection. Both things can be true simultaneously. She may well have a genuine academic basis for the phrase she reached for, and the phrasing itself, stripped of any explanation in the moment, was always going to read as a direct accusation to nearly everyone scrolling past it without context. That gap between intent and how it actually landed is a big part of why this story had the shelf life it did, and it's a pattern worth remembering, because it's not unique to this incident. It's basically the operating principle of every social media-driven sports controversy of the last decade. With the league staying quiet, the pressure didn't go away, it just relocated to people with much bigger platforms than a single team's beat writers. Fox News columnist Jason Concha didn't hold back, calling for a season-long suspension and describing the foul itself as deliberate and politically motivated, explicitly tying it to the backlash Cunningham had already been absorbing over her transgender athlete's comments. A framing that, worth noting, goes considerably further than the league's own review, which found no clear evidence the contact was intentional at all. Analyst Aaron Torres went further still, suggesting bluntly that it might be time for the NBA to consider shutting the league down entirely. A comment that generated its own smaller firestorm, given how disconnected it is from anything the actual facts of this incident support, and given how quickly it revealed that for some commentators, this foul had become a proxy for a much older argument about whether the WNBA deserves to exist as an independent enterprise at all. Sports commentator Emmanuel Aiko weighed in publicly as well, addressing Carrington's post head-on, "You can't call that foul white privilege." Whatever legitimate point she may have been trying to make, in his view, got buried the moment she attached it to a foul that had already been reviewed and upgraded on its own merits, not on who threw it or who absorbed it. It's worth noting how wide that range of reactions actually is, from Aiko's relatively narrow critique of the post's framing, to Torres's much larger and more inflammatory suggestion about the league's future. That range tells you something important. This story stopped being about one foul and one post almost immediately, and became a screen onto which a much wider set of pre-existing opinions about the WNBA, about race in sports commentary, and about the league's growing pains got projected. Some of those projections were grounded in the actual facts of what happened on August 8th. A lot of them clearly weren't, and it's worth being able to tell the difference as a viewer, rather than treating every hot take in that news cycle as carrying equal weight. There's a pattern worth naming across all three of these reactions, because it repeats itself in almost every controversy of this kind. The commentators with the largest platforms rarely engage with the most defensible version of either side's argument. Concha didn't grapple with the league's own stated criteria for a flagrant 2, or with Carrington's 3 flagrant season, when he called the foul politically motivated, a claim the league's own review process gives no support for. Torres didn't engage with the specific facts of this incident at all before jumping to a suggestion about shutting the entire league down. Aiko's critique was the most narrowly targeted of the three, and notably, it's also the one that stuck closest to what actually happened rather than reaching for the largest possible claim. That's not a coincidence either. Outrage that scales up to "this proves something" is fundamentally broken, travels further online than outrage that stays proportionate to the actual incident. And a story like this one, sitting at the intersection of race, gender politics, and a rapidly growing league still establishing its own credibility, is exactly the kind of story that rewards the biggest possible claim rather than the most accurate one. Here's where it's important to slow down and separate what's actually happened from what's being demanded. None of that outside criticism means Adam Silver has done anything about this specific situation, because he hasn't. He hasn't commented on the Cunningham-Carrington incident. He hasn't found anyone connected to it. He hasn't issued any statement tied to it at all. His most recent public comments about the WNBA this year were about something else entirely. The league's finances, including his past acknowledgement that the NBA has historically absorbed significant annual losses to keep the WNBA operating, and a carefully neutral answer, given earlier this year, about whether Commissioner Engelbert will remain in her role beyond this season. On that question, Silver's exact words were that he hadn't had those conversations with her about her future, even while praising the job she's done. Calling for Silver to step in is commentary and pressure. It is not, at this point, anything that's actually happened, and it's worth being precise about that distinction, because a lot of the loudest coverage of this story blurred the line between commentators think Silver should act and Silver is about to act, and those are not the same claim. But that pressure exists for a real structural reason, and it's worth understanding why, because it's the piece that turns this from a foul review story into a bigger picture one. The NBA isn't a distant relative of the WNBA sitting somewhere off to the side. It's functionally the financial backbone underneath it. By publicly reported estimates tied to the league's revenue structure, roughly 40% of WNBA revenue flows through the NBA. Another fifth belongs to outside investors who bought equity in the league through a capital raise a few years back. What's left is split between the teams and the players. Silver himself has previously confirmed the NBA has absorbed real financial losses, year over year, to keep the smaller league running. When two organizations are financially entangled at that level, and a controversy this loud plays out in one of them while its own front office stays silent, it's not exactly unreasonable for people to start asking whether the organization with a bigger platform and deeper pockets should be the one to step in and set the terms. That's a fair question to raise. It is not the same thing as evidence that Silver plans to, and it's worth thinking through why he almost certainly won't, at least not directly. Silver has spent years cultivating a specific relationship with the WNBA, funding it, protecting it, publicly defending its long-term viability, while very deliberately not running it day to day. Stepping into a discipline decision involving a specific player, in a controversy this politically loaded, would blur a line the NBA has worked hard to maintain. That the WNBA is a genuinely separate operation with its own leadership, even if the NBA underwrites a significant share of its costs. Every commentator calling for Silver's direct involvement is, whether they realize it or not, asking him to cross a line he has avoided crossing for years, on one of the most politically sensitive controversies the league has faced. That doesn't mean the pressure has no effect. It means the effect is more likely to show up as private pressure on Engelbert's office than as a public statement from Silver himself, which, notably, would be much harder for outside observers to actually track or hold accountable. And here's the part that makes this moment different from a similar controversy 5 years ago. The audience watching all of it has completely changed in size. WNBA franchise valuations, viewership numbers, and social engagement have all climbed sharply over the past couple of seasons. Nearly every Fever road game right now is close to a sellout. National broadcast numbers are up across the board, and a meaningful chunk of that new audience is genuinely new to the sport, pulled in this season specifically by Clark, by Cunningham, by exactly this kind of high-stakes, high-emotion basketball. That growth cuts in two directions at once. It means the league has far more to lose if a story like this keeps spiraling without a clear response, because a new viewer's first real exposure to how the WNBA handles conflict shapes whether they stick around for the next controversy or decide the league can't manage its own moments. And it means the NBA, as the financial backstop underneath all of it, has more riding on how this gets handled too, even from a distance. So where does that leave Adam Silver, specifically? Not directly involved. Not yet. The person actually responsible for player discipline in this case is Commissioner Engelbert, not Silver. It's her office that's gone quiet here, not his. But between a $1,000 fine that satisfied almost nobody who followed the story closely, a multi-day silence that let the narrative fill in every direction on its own, and a growing chorus of national commentators openly questioning whether the NBA needs to get more involved in how its sister league handles moments like this, the pressure to do more than shrug this off is only building. And it's coming from enough different directions that it's getting harder for the league to simply wait it. There's a simpler way to say all of this, underneath the noise. Every day a league doesn't clarify its own standard, for the foul, for the post, for what actually counts as handled, is another day where fans, columnists, and analysts get to fill that silence with their own version of events. Some of those versions are fair readings of what happened. Some are clear overreaches, like the suggestion that this one incident should end the league's existence. But a league that won't say anything doesn't get to choose which interpretation wins. That's the actual risk sitting underneath this story, and it's a bigger one than any single fine or suspension could be. Silence has a cost, even when nobody in the league office intends it to, and that cost compounds the longer it goes unaddressed, because every new commentator who weighs in without a league statement to react to is filling that vacuum with whatever framing serves their own platform best. There's also a version of this that plays out worse for the league specifically, and it's worth spelling out because it's the scenario that should worry Engelbert's office most. If a similar incident happens again before this one is fully resolved in the public conversation, another hard foul, another charged reaction, another post that touches race or gender politics, the league won't be responding to one controversy anymore. It'll be responding to a pattern of controversies it never clearly addressed the first time, which makes every subsequent response look reactive rather than principled, no matter how it's handled. Leagues that establish clear standards early, even unpopular ones, tend to weather repeat incidents better than leagues that let each one become its own isolated news cycle. Right now, the WNBA is trending toward the second category, and the season still has real basketball left to play. It's also worth placing this inside a slightly longer view of how professional sports leagues, generally, have handled controversies that sit at this exact intersection of race, gender, and player discipline over the past decade or so. The pattern that tends to repeat itself, across multiple sports and multiple leagues, is fairly consistent. Leagues that get out ahead of a controversy with a clear, even briefly stated position, regardless of which side of a debate that position falls on, tend to shorten the news cycle considerably, because commentators and fans have something concrete to react to and argue about, rather than an open vacuum to fill with speculation. Leagues that stay quiet tend to see the opposite effect. The story doesn't fade, it fragments, with different outlets and platforms constructing entirely different versions of what supposedly happened and what it supposedly means, none of which the league itself ever had to sign off on or correct. The WNBA, in this specific case, chose the second path, whether by deliberate strategy or simple institutional hesitation, and the shelf life of this story over the following days is a fairly direct consequence of that choice. It's also worth asking what a genuinely proportionate league response would have even looked like here, because the league should have done more is an easy thing to say and a much harder thing to specify. A statement within 24 hours addressing the foul review directly, confirming the process that led to the Flagrant 2 upgrade, would have cost the league nothing and would have given a fact-based anchor for the conversation to build around, instead of 2 days of speculation filling that gap. A separate statement on the post itself didn't need to punish Carrington further or validate her framing. It needed to exist at all, acknowledging that the league takes public comments touching race seriously enough to say something, rather than letting silence read as either indifference or tacit agreement, depending on which side of the debate you were already on. Neither of those steps required Engelbert's office to take a side in the underlying argument about officiating and race. They required the league to demonstrate it was paying attention, which is a much lower bar than most of the outside criticism assumed the league had failed to clear. Zoom out for a second, because that's really the story underneath the story here. A league in the middle of its most watched, highest revenue, most scrutinized season in its history just showed, twice in 1 month, exactly how it handles pressure. Fast and decisive when the target is an owner in a parking lot confrontation with clear video, an unambiguous villain, and no messy racial or political dimension attached. Slow, quiet, and conflict-averse when the target is one of its own players, in a moment that touches race, that overlaps with an already simmering controversy involving a different player, and where any statement the league makes risks being read as taking a side in a fight it would clearly rather not be in. That's not a coincidence. That's an organization making a calculated bet that staying quiet on the harder case costs less than getting it wrong in public. And for a league this new to this level of national attention, it's worth asking whether that bet is actually sustainable, or whether it just teaches every future controversy how to route around the league's willingness to respond. So here's where this actually lands. A foul upgraded to a flagrant 2, correctly by the league's own stated standard, against a player who'd already picked up 2 prior flagrants on nearly identical plays earlier in the same season. A player who got up off the floor and, instead of letting the league's silence define the story afterward, stood at a podium and answered every hard question herself, in real time, without flinching. A 2-word post that split a locker room and a huge chunk of the internet along exactly the lines you'd expect, from a player with a real academic grounding in the phrase she used, and a rollout that gave almost nobody the context to read it that way. A $1,000 fine, followed by days of near-total silence, followed by that same player back on the floor 2 nights later like nothing had happened at all. And a league that, weeks earlier, had shown it absolutely could move fast and decisively, when the person on the other end of the discipline wasn't wearing its own jersey. Wind-up, impact, follow-through. 3 words the league used to explain why this call was clean. They might also, without meaning to, describe something bigger than one foul review. A pattern of how fast this organization moves, and toward what, and away from what, whenever the spotlight gets uncomfortable enough. This foul review is probably closed by now. Whether the league's silence is the beginning of a bigger reckoning or just something that quietly fades once the next storyline arrives, that part's still an open question, and it's one worth watching closely over the next few weeks, especially given how much attention every remaining Fever game this season is going to draw regardless of what happens next. What happens the next time Indiana and Chicago share a floor is its own small test case. Neither Cunningham nor Carrington has given any public indication of lingering animosity beyond what played out in real time on August 8th. No follow-up statements, no further posts aimed at each other. Nothing suggesting this becomes a running rivalry rather than a single incident both players eventually move past. That's actually the more likely outcome here, and it's worth saying plainly rather than manufacturing a sequel that may never come. Most WNBA players who clash this hard in one game go back to being colleagues within a season, sometimes within weeks. The bigger question was never really about these 2 specific players sustaining a feud. It was always about what the league's handling of their collision reveals about how it handles pressure more broadly, and that answer doesn't reset just because the next Fever Sky matchup passes without incident. If nothing else changes, the next time a comparably loud controversy lands on the league's own roster instead of an owner's box, the same test happens again, with the same 2 options in front of Engelbert's office. Move fast, or let it sit and hope commentators lose interest before the silence itself becomes the headline. This time, it became the headline. Whether that changes anything about how the next one gets handled is genuinely unclear, and it's the single most useful thing to watch for going forward. More useful, honestly, than anything left to resolve about this specific foul. Do you think the WNBA needs outside pressure from the NBA before it actually addresses this directly? Or is that giving the league too much credit for wanting to avoid the subject in the first place? Put your answer in the comments. I read all of them. And if you want to be here the moment this league finally says something official, hit subscribe, because when it happens, we'll be breaking it down in full.